change my name again. It always comes up as somebody else. Who was in the last one? Who's doing a double feature today? Let me know. James, Jerry. That was so great. That was a great starting webinar for this. So yeah, so I just want to quickly say you guys are amazing. So we're doing this to help with, helping give writers some really awesome free webinars from some amazing people, and also raising awareness for Animal Rescue Mission, which is, this lighting is hideous, but also to raise awareness for my Animal Rescue Mission. It's me and 3 partners, and we rescue dogs and cats and roosters, everything under the sun, a fawn, and we do, thank you, Lisa, and we do, that's what, I don't just send you guys 1,000 emails a day, I promise, but a lot of what we do is just getting dogs in bad situations and kill shelters. And I gave a list of people who donated to the Animal Rescue, the fawn. Don't even get me, that was a story. But if you go to the link, theanimalrescuemission.org, and if you donate, that's great. You don't have to, but any little bit helps. And just from the last webinar to this, John Westbrook, Michael Godecki, Richard Simon, Dave Pantano, Katie Dorr, thank you so much. I'm sure other people did as I was saying that, but just in the 5-minute interim between webinars. And again, it all goes to Animal Rescue. I do not get a cent from it. I have actually put a lot of money into it. So there is that. Yeah, and then the last thing, and I'm so sorry, it's a sad world sometimes, but I promise I won't say anything that's too hideous. But also in the 5-minute increment, we found, somebody found a dog in a box. Dog's fine, but literally has been living in a box for God knows how long. It's a little 40-pound indigo. It's like a cute little fox-looking dog. I think it's called indigo, or Jindo, I forgot what it's called, but it looks like a little fox. If anybody can foster in the Los Angeles area, just email me, joey@roadmapwriters.com. We need a foster because God knows what is happening to this dog. The dog is, I think, safe right now, but we do need a foster. And if you could donate any little bit helps. Okay, cool. So we're going to talk to Joshua Nadler from Sony Affirm. I actually disabled the chat box last time because there was things being written there that didn't have anything to do with the webinar. So I'm going to keep it activated for now. But if you have any questions, put it in the Q&A box. We might have time for questions at the end. We might not. I have some prepared, why couldn't I say that word? Prepared questions prior. Someone asked that. If there's room at the end, I will ask questions. Yeah, so if you go to this link, I don't know if you guys could see it. Actually, no. You go to this link. That is the link. Again, you don't have to, but it's also, that's where all the available dogs are. Well, I should say a portion of them. If anybody wants to foster, I know a lot of you in the program have been so great and have fostered or currently fostering dogs and cats that we find. So great. Okay, well, without further ado, let's bring Josh into the mix, and I'm gonna promote you to panelist. Oh, I hate this light. I wish it was just symmetrical. Do you know what I mean? Maybe my face. That's why. But hey, Josh.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good. I have my air conditioning going, so does this sound okay?
I hear nothing.
Okay, cool.
I hear nothing. I love a nice little soothing air conditioner sound in the background.
Let it wash over you.
Let it wash over you, yes. Yeah. How are you? Whereabout do you live?
I live in Los Angeles. I'm in Silver Lake, which is just east of Hollywood.
Exact address? No, I'm just kidding. Apartment number?
And donations to me. Wow.
Yeah, seriously. Well, it's so great to see you.
Good to see you as well.
So I guess let's just jump right in.
Are we live right now with people?
Live, baby.
All right. Hello,
Live,
everyone.
128 people and counting.
All right.
So tell us a little bit about your journey to Sony Affirm.
Well, the journey was sort of straightforward in that I was looking for something in development, and I had come from production and love production, but it's very hard. It's long hours, and ended up at Sony at the right place, right time. They had just started the Affirm Films division and needed some help, and I was there. So I started working for them on the ground floor, and we sort of built this division up over the past decade.
Yeah.
A lot of fun.
Right place, right time.
Yeah.
Somebody says, yes, it'll be available later. Did you know much about faith-based films before you started?
No, I had grown up in the South, sort of in the Bible Belt, and, grew up in the church, knew about faith, knew about sort of the nuances, and like, an expert as anyone would be in whatever you grew up in, is sort of a shorthand. But I was very, I wasn't very aware of Christian culture, movies, music, books. I was very sort of mainstream. So, excuse me. I was just a film nerd that happened to start working for a division that looked for faith content. So it felt like it felt like God was kind of, whether you believe in God or not, if you do, he was definitely kind of, I think, laughing at this, knowing that like I'd be the last person to be looking for this kind of product.
That's the next movie you guys have to do. The Josh Nadler biopic.
Josh Nadler biopic, yes.
Well, let me ask, because I'm an idiot and I don't even know I'm not really sure I know what faith-based actually means in terms of what you all consider it. So tell us a little bit what you actually mean by faith-based.
So, for faith-based, it's really what we're talking about we talk about Christian movies, right? And when you think about Christian movies, you have this, we all have this sort of idea in our head about, low budget, kind of cheesy, melodrama, and there is a lot of that kind of content out there for sure that you could kind of define as Christian movies. What was interesting for this specific division is that we're a part of a studio, and being a part of a studio, we were sort of just looking for theatrical content, right? And that happened to speak towards the faith audience. And so for us, we see faith movies as sort of broad movies that could speak to the faith audience as well as sort of the general audience. So like an example that everyone can kind of point to is The Blind Side. Is sort of one of those movies that we sort of point to and go, listen, like it's a broad studio movie, but it also happens to be about a family of faith. Their faith is touched on in the movie in a way that's organic. And when you market this movie, it's, the general audience sees a nice studio film, and the Christian audience may see a movie that's also for them because it is tackling a family of faith. So that's kind of what we think of it at Sony as sort of a faith movie, is something more on the broader side.
So it doesn't have, when I saw Blind Side, I didn't even really digest any kind of religious elements. I was just engrossed in the story. So faith-based doesn't have to hit you over the head with the film. Right. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I think when you think about movies that hit you over the head with their message, specifically if you're defining them as sort of faith or Christian movies, those tend to be movies that aren't as easy to market to a broad audience, right? And when you think about theatrical movies, wide theatrical releases, those inherently need to be marketed to a broad audience. And so the challenge, which is, the interesting challenge is taking these stories of faith and developing them for the screen in a way that speaks to a broader audience. And I think that's sort of the goal.
So,
Go ahead.
So like for somebody who wants to dabble in faith-based but doesn't know much about, I guess, I guess, religion, can they write something about like an inspirational story where the protagonist happens to be Catholic or religious?
Sure. I mean, it's you don't need to be like a specific. You don't need to be Batman to write the next Batman script, right? Like
Yeah.
it's, So I would say, of course, like what we look for, as just another studio division is just writers that know how to write, that can deliver. When we put together a movie, we're not going, where are all the Christian writers or the Christian directors? We're just going, who can we put together for another movie that could, so we, when we've made the movie, we go, okay, this turned out pretty well. Cause we work with people that have made movies before.
Yeah. And how, like, I know in the traditional sense is like trying to package it. You need the Julia Roberts or whatever. But in terms of like faith-based, is that less important?
So it depends on the budget and the material, right? So if you think about something like The Blind Side, that had one of the biggest actresses in the world, playing the lead, right? And what you're able to do with that kind of movie is transcend its sort of faith genre, and it's more of a broader film. If when you're putting together a smaller movie, it might not be cast dependent. A lot of times what we're doing is looking at material and deciding if something is cast dependent or not. So when we did a movie about the Apostle Paul, and that name carries so much weight, so much, you even call it intellectual property, right? You don't need a big actor to play Paul in order to get across in marketing to the Christian audience that, hey, we made a Paul movie. If you're only spending, $5 or $6 million on it. If you're gonna make a $50 million movie, whether it was about Paul or The Blind Side, which The Blind Side costs about 30, but it's still a decent sized budget, especially nowadays. You're gonna start becoming cast dependent to a certain degree. It really depends on budget, and budget is sometimes connected to the material, right? You don't want to you don't want to make a Marvel movie for $3 million. It just wouldn't work out as well.
Yeah.
Right. So
Would you say, because I know there's so much talk about like traditional indie films being harder to make, especially with theaters not being open right now. Is that the same with lower budget faith-based, or will there always be a market?
Well, I think it depends on the project, right? So there have been a lot of low budget Christian movies that have been made over the years, right? Some of them get theatrical releases, some of them don't. Some of them get wide theatrical releases, some of them get limited theatrical releases. And a lot of that has to do with what the distributor sees as the potential as far as audience, right? So when you think of a faith-based movie like I Can Only Imagine, which came out 2 years ago, this movie was based on one of the biggest crossover Christian songs of all time, called I Can Only Imagine, right? And, this movie was done at a smaller budget, but it still did really well in theaters. It did 80 to 90 million in the box office. But you can't say, every time, oh, hey, if I make a Christian movie, a low budget Christian movie, there's 80 or 90 million in the box office waiting for us if we just release it, right?
Yeah.
So once again, you have to get back to what the subject matter is, the idea, a lot of it is appetite. And I was just at a lunch meeting today talking about appetite. And appetite is really important.
Wait, how appropriate, by the way.
What's that?
A lunch meeting talking about appetite? Very apropos. Yeah.
Right. Appetite for movies, right? And so as, not only all the filmmakers listening, you're also audience members. You're also people that are buying tickets or paying your monthly fees, like for your Netflix account and Hulu and all that, right? So you guys also need to understand when you're writing a movie or figuring out how to put a project together, what it means. Is there going to be an appetite for your movie? And when a studio or a theatrical distributor is thinking about, when we're looking at a script, we're thinking about, man, we got to put this out, right, in theaters. Is there going to be an appetite for this? And what's interesting about streaming is that that question doesn't really matter as much anymore, because we're all watching a lot of content on streaming, but we're not all watching it at the same time. And the barrier to entry, you know, when a movie drops on Hulu or Netflix or Amazon Prime, the barrier to entry to see that movie now is a lot lower for us. So it ceases to matter as much when movies hit the ecosystem. But when we're talking about more of a straightforward window of the theatrical window, we still got to think about, is there going to be an appetite for this, you know, in theaters? And that's a hard question to answer now.
Are there certain I'm so intrigued.
Yeah.
Are there certain territories that are like your target demo? Is it the South? Is it international? Is it?
So as far as faith movies, they tend to, you know, when we're talking, you know, we're talking about sort of like Christian stories, Christian drama. We're really talking about the US and Canada. Certain movies overperform in other territories internationally. You know, some movies do really well in Central and South America with a more Hispanic-centric audience. Some movies do really well in South Korea, which has a really large Christian population. So again, it comes down to the story. When we do a sports film, like when we did a football movie, we knew that in general, the international wasn't going to do well. You know, football movies don't travel. Even though it had a faith-based component to it, even though you could call it a faith-based football movie, it was still a broad, you know, sports film.
Yeah.
And we weren't, as a studio, counting on our international territories when we were running, you know, doing like, you know, a studio or any distributor is going to put together a model of what we think we're going to get out of the world, right? All the territories. So when you do something like a football film, we know we're not counting on the international markets to deliver back to us. So we're not putting up like, you know, we're not counting that as our, like, to mitigate our risk, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What would you say? Because I'm sure, especially in your department,
yeah,
there's such a sensitivity about, especially if it goes maybe a lot into religion and making sure it's authentic. What are some tropes that you read and you're like, oh no, this crosses the line, or this is not appropriate?
So I think, you know, a lot of that is sort of can be seen as subjective, right? And so there's been a lot of like Christian, you know, quote unquote Christian movies that have sort of gotten by on their divisiveness, on sort of politicizing issues. And that could work for a core part of a faith audience that is looking, you know, the phrase preaching to the choir kind of a thing. And as a division of a studio, we are just looking for movies that have mainly a component of entertainment value, right? So we're not looking to solve any political issues or move the needle in terms of how people are voting, right? Like that is not the studio's job. The studio is this giant global corporation, right? And so we tend to stay away in general from anything that's going to pick a side in very politicized or divisive issues. And we kind of all can kind of know what those are, especially in these times, in these sort of polarized times.
Yeah, I'm sure.
When we look for material, we're really looking for uplifting stories, human interest stories, right? That happen to be about people who are overcoming adversity. You know, you need conflict in any movie, where their faith plays a part in that organically. And we're not trying to get a message across. We're trying to tell a story that reminds us of what it means to be courageous and heroic, you know, all those things.
You know, we have a couple of questions that came in, and some of these questions are so great. Does faith-based mean Christian only?
So in the US, you know, being a domestic distributor first, it kind of does, right? What we're really talking about is this sort of Judeo-Christian milieu of 80% of the people in the US go to church almost every Sunday. So when we're talking about the Christian audience, what we're really talking about is the US audience and trying to make movies for them first. It's the same thing, you know, when a studio is making a football movie. I bring up football again, but like football is a very American sport. And so, you know, we're thinking, like, if you take that logic, you know, we're thinking first of, can we release something in the US, you know, broadly? And everything else internationally follows suit after, if there is opportunity there or not. But we are always thinking about the US domestic audience first. And as the faith division, that audience is overwhelmingly Christian. You know, that is just the country we're living in. And so
yeah,
if the studio system, if Hollywood was based in the Middle East, the faith-based division of the studio would probably be doing mainly product that spoke to the Muslim community, right? It's just sort of where we happen to be as far as the entertainment community in the US as a faith-based division.
I've never heard the word Christian so much in this past 20 minutes that I did in all my time in CCD in school. I feel like I'm in flashbacks. Okay, I had to deactivate the chat because it started getting a little weird. So going back to the Q&A, I'll reactivate it a little later. A couple of people asked this question, Katie and Maureen. I think it's a great question.
Okay.
What about limited series or just TV? Is there such a thing?
Yeah, I mean, you know, TV in general is wide open now, right? And you know, TV could look like so many things, and so many, you know, when we're talking about TV, what we're really talking about is the streaming platforms. You know, that also, you know, like my package, I'm sure like a lot packages have the cable package available. So like what we thought of as traditional TV is still there, right? ABC, NBC, FX, Hulu, you know. But what we're really talking about is the ecosystem of what comes through our television, the content. And that could be movies, that could be feature length, that could be limited series. And so, yeah, there is space for that. It's just, I think in general, it still tends to be broader. And I think what I love about the ecosystem of streaming is that regardless of what faith you are or ethnicity or race, there is so many there's so many opportunities to tell so many unique stories. And I think, so when you're asking about faith-based or Christian, like, you're like, yeah, of course, like there's space for that too. There's space for everything. There's almost infinite space for all the content when we're talking about the streaming platforms, right?
Yeah.
And Sony in particular, our Affirm division, for the better part of a decade that we've been around, has been focusing on the theatrical experience, on the straightforward theatrical model. And we just added earlier this year, a TV executive that is working with our TV division, looking for stuff that could be for the Affirm milieu, for the faith-based milieu. But out the gate, that executive is thinking in broader terms all the time. And so it could look like a lot of things, you know. We all remember, whether we watched it or not, that show Touched by an Angel, right? Like, when we think of like overtly faith-based TV, there's very few things that feel like we could point to. But I think there's so much interesting stuff happening with all faith, or lack thereof. There's also so many stories. I think of Rami, the show Rami on Hulu, about the Gen X, the Gen Y Muslim experience, right, in New York. I think of Crashing on HBO, which is all about this Christian comedian, but it's a Judd Apatow production. So you have this sort of like HBO edge, you know, met with a guy trying to figure out his faith as he's trying to do stand-up in New York, right? So I think when we talk about TV, we talk about the sort of streaming universe, there's just I think sky's the limit, you know, there's just so much opportunity.
I felt like before this, I always had like a preconceived notion what faith-based was. I
Right.
thought it was like Jesus, page 1, through all the pages. Like, but there's so much layers to it.
Sure.
There's a couple people ask this question about genre.
Yeah.
Can there be such thing as like a horror faith-based story?
Sure. I mean, it's when we talk about genre, we're really talking about a couple different things, right? When we make genre movies, whether you're a writer or a studio exec or a producer, you want to make sure that you're making something for the people that show up to those genre, whatever genre it is. So like, horror movies, are very dependent on the people that come out to see horror movies. And I think of the Exorcism of Emily Rose is a movie that was able to cross over and speak to the faith condition really well. I think another, I think it's possible, but it really starts off as a genre movie first. And then if there's a faith component, if there's a way to like market it as well to the faith audience, I think that is like the proverbial icing on the cake. But to start it as a faith movie and then go, it's a faith movie, but we're also gonna get the horror crowd. I think it's a tougher way to go. And so like the Conjuring is like another example of, the couple that is, the characters that you see through each sequel, The Conjuring, right? That couple is, their faith is very important to them. It's played out very organically. They take the supernatural very seriously. And I think that is another franchise that has crossed over and speaks to the faith, the life of our interfaith, as well as the sort of broader genre tropes of a horror movie.
So if you got The Conjuring script before it came out, before it like was even made, and you were like, would you consider that a film for Sony Affirm?
No, it would be something for like Columbia Pictures or Screen Gems, right? The Exorcism of Emily Rose is a Screen Gems movie, right? So like, it would start in another division, or we would bring in another division. This is all internally, right? But like, we would talk internally and be like, hey, we see an opportunity for the faith audience with this movie, but it isn't the tip of the spear. It is just a part of the milieu. This is a horror movie. This should be made, this should be made by a different division, and then we'll come along, make sure it continues to speak to the faith audience, but it's probably not something we would push. I think when you start, where you start to get into exceptions to the rule is what we're really talking about is IP, right? So books, comics, I talked about that movie, I Could Only Imagine. That was a piece of IP based on this huge song. And so when you think about like the Narnia books, that established itself as, it's a crossover, right? They are beloved, the Hobbit books, these are beloved by Christian audiences. It's seen as they're seen as broad works as well. But if someone had come to us with a spec script about a wardrobe that takes you to a magical land and there's a lion and that lion's also God, and you're like, we would probably be like, not, I don't think that's for us.
Yeah.
But the fact that Narnia, the books established in the marketplace, in the zeitgeist, this sort of idea of what it is, that's when you start to make exceptions for the rule, right? All that being said, Affirm is really in the true story business. We're more in the straightforward drama and looking for stories that that feel like they should be movies, that feel like they're special. Most everything we've done, everything that's in development right now is essentially based on true stories. And
the true story could be anything from like The Blind Side and like a story in the Bible.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
And then time for maybe two more questions.
Okay.
When somebody's pitching to you,
yes,
is it important that they start with why it's faith-based, or should they pitch it differently than if they were pitching anybody else?
Yeah, I think if they're coming to us, it's sort of automatically known that like they're coming to us with something that could speak to the faith-based audience. And it's really up to the story itself. And again, it's a true, like for us, it's a true story. Like I'm not here to get pitched someone's like world building idea, you know, about monsters. Like it's just not our division, right? Like we're looking for those books, for those like those viral videos, those things that catch the imagination. And you look at it, it goes, oh, that could be a movie, right? And so when we're pitched something, like with anything else, it's really about, you know, it's sort of unspoken that there's some sort of faith element to it. And then what really matters is that they are conveying the movie version of this material to us.
Yeah.
And that's really where we want to start, you know?
And this is a good question too, that was a slide in. Is there a market for faith-based shorts?
Well, I mean, again, like, is there a market for shorts? And so you could say yes, but it's not a lucrative market. It's not a lucrative thing. You know, there is the ecosystem online of like digital shorts, right? Digital content, short form content. So sure, I mean, you know, it could be like, that's where you really could get into sort of, you know, turning narrative on its head, you know, like, you know, High Maintenance is sort of one of the best examples, right? It really sort of was a unique way into short form narrative.
Yeah.
It was such a good show that HBO picked it up as a series, but it never lost the spirit of how it translated from short form, you know, to what it is. You know, like I think I'm like, HBO is on the brain all the time. I love HBO content, but like I think it's called Room 104, which is a Duplass Brothers production. You know, that is an anthology. So it's essentially each season is like 8 short films. So I think, you know, short form is always really meant to be, up until a certain point, a bite-sized idea of something larger that could be monetized. Short content is very hard to monetize. But with streaming, there's always a way to like aggregate and anthologize a lot of content that could be done in short form though. So
would you say The Leftovers is faith-based?
The Leftovers definitely deals, I love The Leftovers. I love that show. I was a big fan of it. Is it something that could be marketed to the Christian audience as saying this is something for you, right? But as prestige television, I think there have been a lot of people of faith that have probably found that show very interesting by the fact that it's tackling an idea that could be, you know, seen as a rapture type event, which is very much in like the cultural narrative or Christian narrative of culture, of like the rapture, you know, the end times. And they explored it in such a unique way, you know, and of course it was based on a novel. And that novel did this amazing job of setting that table, building that world. And then you had this brilliant showrunner in Damon who really ran with it in those last 2 seasons, you know. And I know I didn't really answer the question, but what we're really talking about is not so much as something faith-based. When we're looking at a piece of product, it's can we market it to the faith-based audience? You know, there are plenty of things that people of faith are going to gravitate towards without having to define it as Christian or faith-based. But for us, when we put together a movie, we have to ask ourselves, is this something that could be marketed to the Christian audience?
Got it.
As well as the broader audience.
That makes sense. Cool. Everybody stay on for a sec. We're a couple minutes over. So Josh, thank you so much. This is so great. I feel enlightened. And thank you so much. It's so good seeing you.
Good seeing you too, man.
Cool.
Bye, guys.
Yay. Awesome. Okay, let me stop the recording.